based webinar করেছি, and this fourth one is based on presentations by research scholars. ঠিক আছে? তো
Related to theory and practice.
হ্যাঁ, থিওরি, এটার নামটা হচ্ছে ইন্ডিজেনিটি থিওরি অ্যান্ড প্র্যাকটিস, তাই তো?
Yeah.
মানে লোকেটিং ইন্ডিজেনিটি থিওরি অ্যান্ড প্র্যাকটিস. So the first speaker today is Debjani Chakraborty. Debjani has completed her bachelor's and master's in comparative literature from Jadavpur University, and then she went on to do an MPhil degree from Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, where she wrote a dissertation titled History, Orality and Denigration, Exploring the Pardi Over. She is presently pursuing her PhD from the Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University, and writing a thesis on the oratures and oral history of a denotified tribe known as the Pardis. Debjani was awarded the JRF for qualifying in the National Eligibility Test in Comparative Literature in July 2018. Notable papers presented by Debjani in international conferences include titles such as Of Midnights and Memories, Rethinking Margins with Judy Fong Bates, Codes of Censorship in Pre-Independent India, and Analysis of Chugtai and the Progressive Writers, Politicized Remembrances, Exploring the Calibrations of Memory and Identity in Ondatie's Over. Over to you, Debjani.
Thank you, Sucharita ji. Let me begin by saying hello to everyone who is present here and thanking both Sucharita ji and Devoshri ji for this opportunity. The paper I'm going to read out today is titled Learning to Listen, Grappling with Questions of Epistemic Violence on the Field. This paper would highlight the knowledges that I gained about indigeneity and the indigenous community I worked with through the trials I faced and the mistakes I made while on fieldwork. I have been working with a subcaste of an ex-criminal tribe. The new nomenclature describes them as denotified and nomadic tribes in and around Madhya Pradesh. To count the layers of oppression that they have historically faced and they face to this day would be an exercise in futility, for the more time one spends with them, the more one marvels at their grit and determination and their sheer will to survive in the face of newer and insurmountable odds each day. There are, I believe, deeply philosophical and political arguments to be made in favor of field work, one of which I would be discussing in this paper. This argument is that the field helps us come to terms with the fact that irrespective of our intentionality, we are but a step away constantly from taking up the mantle of the oppressor. That we, each of us right now, are oscillating between the states of potential oppressor and proto-oppressor. And this is not merely because we are glancing in from the outside. Conversely, one might venture to ask if indeed we are proto-oppressors, whether the world isn't better off if the field is not explored and remains idyllic, so to speak. Must we, as sociologists, anthropologists, historians, and literateurs, insert ourselves into a situation where there will always be chances of us doing more harm than good? Let me try and address this question through the specificity of my own research. First, although several scholars, including the likes of Meena Radhakrishnan and G.N. Devi, as well as our very own Mahashweta Devi, have written on denotified and nomadic tribes, this particular community has not been written about except a handful of newspaper articles here and there. Additionally, as a scholar, one is specifically interested in their oral history and oratures which have never been documented. And why is that? That is because a group that has been historically oppressed has no claim on history to this day, have no trace of their lives, their stories, and their survivals beyond the ones relegated to them for the purposes of colonial administration. There are scholars that have advocated reading against the grain to let the silences in the archives and the documents or official records speak for themselves. It is a practice that a lot of scholars undertake, but it is not without its own problematics. Spivak, for instance, in her essay on the Rani of Sirpur, in a particularly poignant section, mentions that despite all her efforts, the Rani still seems elusive, that she can almost touch her with her fingertips, but she still remains beyond her reach. And although this sounds like poetic fascination, the rhetoric is just a vehicle for scholarly frustration. The stories of the violently oppressed and hence the vociferously ignored, Spivak writes, is swathed in what she calls the shadow of shadows, letting out a glimpse only to serve imperialist purposes. Perhaps for similar reasons, when Mahashweta Devi was undertaking her historical treatise on the Rani of Jhansi, she chose to traipse the length and breadth of the rugged Bundelkhandi terrain, uncovering stories like a literary archaeologist. This is one of the primary reasons why I chose to undertake field work and why I still stand by that choice. Because in certain instances, the archive can only serve as an embellishment and not the fundament. It is also significant to note here that I am also working with a living community. For my research, the research I have chosen, it is not just a matter of uncovering and detailing a gross injustice done or a gross injustice completed, but in a somewhat Primo-Levi-esque manner, stand witness to and be chronicler of injustices being done on a continuous loop and record how this injustices and the various responses to it are weaving and altering the tapestry of our nationhood. The next question inevitably becomes what does one do when one is on the field? How does one conduct oneself? And this is perhaps the most complicated question of them all. Although scholars like Judith Oakley and Patricia Galloway, who work with living communities or have worked with living communities in the past, have stressed time and time again that ethicality must be the bedrock of collaborative researches such as these. There have been voices of concern, not unfounded, from various indigenous communities of unscrupulous practices and conduct by researchers. For instance, Linda Toohey Smith writes that researchers have often stripped indigenous people of their knowledges without granting them anything in return. The question of unethical practices arise, I believe, not because researchers are somehow a species consisting of like unethical people, at least not always, but because it is a delicate tightrope to walk. Let me paint you a scenario here. With the family in Nasipur that I was working, a toddler had developed severe skin problems. This beautiful child was covered in itchy scabs that rendered her unable to do anything in peace and hence be constantly irritable. She was unable to eat, sleep, play, or do anything because she was in constant discomfort. The family members were administering plant based medication sourced from the nearby hillocks, which was, at least to my eyes, not working for weeks that then slipped into months. I considered intervening. I considered advising them to administer some allopathic medication, but then I consciously stopped myself. They are cripplingly poor people who wouldn't be able to afford medication unless it came from a government dispensary. But such a dispensary was far away and they couldn't afford the public vehicle fare. I could have bought the medication for the child, but would I be able to keep it up and sustain the medication? And if I could, how would that alter my relations with them? At any rate, would it be the ethical thing to intervene with my access to what I gauge is superior medication supported by science and teach them, look at me, learn from me, this is how you should take care of your child, or this is how you should take care of this particular malady? Contrarily, is my decision to stay away from the issue a prevention of epistemic violence or a conduction of it? Is my health not the same kind of granting, or at least similar granting, that Toohey Smith speaks about? If it is not, and if it is not beyond a shadow of doubt, how am I any different from the Franz Boas school of anthropology that has been so severely critiqued by the likes of scholars like Paul Rabinow and others? The question then becomes, what am I doing overall? The answer to that is succinct. Listen. Oral historian Alessandro Portelli says that the only job of the field researcher is to listen without fear or favor, affection or ill will. More poignantly, perhaps, Dipesh Chakraborty writes in an essay from the book Habitations of Modernity, deconstructionists have argued for a long time that voice is no indicator of direct presence. But the very act of listening to people orients us, opens us up to their presence, however elusive the matter of presence may be from a philosophical point of view. This orientation is what I have called here the act of confronting suffering, of facing, writing couched in legal and universal language of rights and citizenship, erases the history in which acts of facing the sufferers and confronting the scene of oppression occur. Fine. The aim is therefore to listen. But how does one listen? Like a fly on the wall. You can't because you're too distinct in their midst. Or is it by following the example of earlier anthropologists and trying to become a participant in their lived realities? That is not, or at least in my field experience, that is not a potential solution either. Because I tried both and I failed spectacularly. Given the history of oppression that they have faced at the hands of upper caste people, oh, you can't do that because you are never separate from your location. You might try to consciously separate yourself, but the field will be, or and the other members of the field will be aware of your location constantly. Given the history of the oppression that they have faced at the hands of upper caste people, I was acutely aware of my caste identity and even, to a certain extent, ashamed of it. I tried to avoid the caste question for as long as I could in a land and culture where the second question anyone ever asks you is your caste. That is a significant parameter of their lives, and when I say their lives, I mean the community's lives, because they don't know if they can be themselves around you or if they will somehow incur your upper caste wrath by accidentally offending you, which they have suffered in the past. I did not know how to deal with it, and I did not deal with it very well either. The revelation of my caste ensured that the epithet Bangal ki Panditain never left me, although my long term relations with them prevented it from becoming a significant barrier. In the face of these problematics, one might say that there will always be foundational dictums that one can adhere to when it comes to being respectable, such as don't be patronizing, don't appropriate their stories or their voices. I'm here to tell you that even these dictums are muddled in the complexities of the field. Let's approach the first one, don't be patronizing. What is one supposed to do when one is being told that beating up the women of the family, wives particularly, is a proud part of their heritage and their daily lives? What is one supposed to do if one witnesses such a scenario? Intervention without state aid would be perfunctory. Intervention with it would constitute serious epistemic violence. And no intervention at all would mean that one willingly chooses to place ontological primacy on the questions of indigeneity versus the questions of gender. But when one is choosing that, either of the choices is difficult. Either of the choices might be unethical. Either of the choices might constitute violence. Or what is the other one? Don't appropriate their stories or their voices. What happens when a Pardhi, very visibly pregnant Parthi woman has been detained and is being tortured and beaten up in a police chowki, and you have to intervene and you have to tell them that, or explain to the authorities that they were in the forest not because they are killing animals but because they grew up around the forest, that this is their heritage, that she's pregnant. I am at that point, or anyone is at that point, resorting to their heritage and their history and their stories in order to perform this intervention. So technically, it is in that moment an act of appropriation, irrespective of the intentionality, perhaps. I think I'm almost out of time. I recognize that I have raised hard questions and not provided any easy answers. The reason for that is that there are no easy answers and there are no answers at all, full stop. The only thing one can do is continue to engage, because the notion of the idyllic field mentioned earlier is a myth, and continue to be honest about the nuances of that engagement, such that if one does have slippages where one takes up the mantle of the oppressor or becomes a proto oppressor, one is immediately reprimanded by the community around oneself, and one realizes one's earliest and foremost aim, which is to unearth, as Ranajit Guha would put it, the small voices of history. Yeah. Thank you. That will be the end of my paper.
Thank you, Devjani.
Did I stick
Thank
to
you,
the time
Devjani.
limit, Sucharita?
Yes, absolutely. We are fine with this. Thank you so much. We will keep all the questions till the end of the
Yeah,
session.
yes.
Okay. Devasri, do you want to add anything?
No, I think there are a few things to discuss which we can do once we have all the papers. Like we
Yeah,
can get
lots to
that.
discuss actually.
Yeah, number
But
of questions
let's
they've
wait.
done it. Yeah,
Exactly.
number
So
of questions. Yeah.
we'll move on to the next speaker now. We'll move on to the next speaker now. The next speaker today would be Dipanjan Kundu, who is now pursuing his research work under the PhD program 2020 in Shidukanu Birsha University, Purulia. The purview of his interest includes posthumanism and disability studies. He has completed his BA in English from Bakura Christian College, the University of Bardhaman, and MA in English from the same university in 2017. In Masters, he wrote a dissertation on the new historicist study of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which was later published in the journal Appropriations by BCC. The Strange Case of Mad Jekyll and Bad Hyde is his other paper, published in its next volume. He has presented papers on feminist studies of mythologies in Bakura University, subaltern studies of Amish Tripathi's works in Bardhaman University, and post-anthropocentric exposition of Gabriel Okara's select poems in BB College, Asansol. Recently, in a webinar in SKBU, he has presented a paper on the representation of epidemic of 1665 in London in Daniel Defoe's journal and Samuel Pepys's diary. Over to you, Dipanjan, and if you could just tell us the topic when you begin. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. My regards to everyone present here. I request the coordinators to allow me to present the screen. May I, ma'am?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. My the topic of my paper is politics of representation of indigeneity in Indian films and popular culture. Indigenous people are represented in a marginalized way in mainstream Indian films and culture. They do not hold the center stage in the films like Aranyer Dinratri by Satyajit Ray. Even Gautam Ghosh has presented them as a bunch of kidnappers in Abar Aranye. They are otherized in every sense of the term. Ritik Ghatak has ventured in many of his films to force the attention upon the Adivasis. In his films like Ajantrik and Jukti Tokkor Goppo, he has captured shots of tribal dances. But in the end, they remain as mere momentary glances within a larger urban framework. In Newton by Masurkar, the tribes remain the tribes are displayed as anti-democratic insurgent group trying to annul the election process. The Indian films endeavored to identify with the tribal people, but at length they are advertised as figures of a confounded conundrum. In an interview, Mrinal Sen claims that while shooting the film Mrigoya or The Royal Hunt in a Santal village, a sense of lyricism lurks in the climate. It is not only in the landscape alone, the lyricism is in the behavioral pattern of the people there. In another interview, Sen also drew our attention to the error in the myth of Ekalabya and Guru Dronacharya. The master asks the devout disciple to offer his thumb so that he cannot throw arrows anymore. But the Adivasi people informed Sen that they hold arrows between the middle finger and index finger without any use of the thumb. These two instances fortify the fact that the indigenous people are not any inferior crowd to the majority. Rather, they are enriched with a special kind of knowledge system integral to survive in the adverse wilderness in communion with ferocious beasts. The realistic feature films like Mrigoya by Sen and Akrosh by Gobind Nihalani exemplify the new wave in Indian cinema. These sorts of films bring about the socio-cultural matrices where intersections of populace are torched by oppression and inequality. Mrigoya ostents the innocuous tribal people, indulged in the lap of the wild greenery and untamed animals. The protagonist, Ghinua, adeptly portrayed by Mithun Chakraborty, embodies Rousseau's idea of the noble savage. However, it stereotypifies an Adivasi young man with glistening physique and agility of a wild deer. Akrosh is an explosive social study of the seeds of violence induced by a tortuous state machinery. With an excellent screenplay written by Bijay Tendulkar and under the skillful directions of Nihalani, as well as the unsettling dialogues composed by Satyadev Dubey, this film delineates the raging silence of an indigenous peasant, Bhiku Lahania, caused by the governing crushed by the governing administration and political power on the one hand, and the lascivious jamindars or landlords and upper caste societal hierarchy on the other. The story in the film, the least of these, the Grahamstein story, 2019, by Anish Daniel, takes place in a remote location of India called Baripada, where the titular character Grahamsteins served at a leprosy home for the outcasts of society for 35 years. The narrative is being told from the point of view of a journalist who is commissioned to nail Graham with the charges of illegal conversion. Here, the tribal people are projected as lepers, homeless, and hopeless victims who need redemption by a white Australian missionary and whose stories necessitate an upper caste Hindu journalist to be displayed. But at length, Steins is persecuted by the same tribal people. Indigenous people are shown as easily convincible, ungrateful, violent, and primitive bunch of people who do not even flinch a bit from burning their rescuer alive at stake, the sort of mishaps that used to take place in the medieval Europe. The typical feathered regalia, drums, and ritual dances around a bonfire have also been habitually associated with the indigenous people in this film. The Song of Scorpions, directed by Anup Singh, is a story of a tribal woman in Rajasthan who can cure patients stung by scorpions with her melodious singing. This is a legacy that she inherits from her grandmother. The film, set in the undulating sands of the Thar Desert, captures the ebb and flow of a woman's misery, love, betrayal, revenge, and forgiveness. The film treats the protagonist as an individual with distinct nuances, not by straitjacketing into homogeneous stereotypes of indigenous female sexuality. The duo Irfan Khan as Adam, a camel dealer, and Farhani as Nuran, the scorpion singer, have successfully caught the tune efficiently played by Anup Singh by blending the indigenous tradition of scorpion myth of Rajasthan with a modern tale of complex emotions immanent in a heterosexual relationship. Anup Singh has a fondness for the variegated folklores of tribes and age-old communities, evident in another of his momentous film, Kissa, The Tale of a Lonely Ghost. Cinema is the most felicitous agency that can direct an affinity between the viewer and the narrative or narrator. The audience can perceive and empathize with the characters' motives and sentiments even if they belong to a separate lingo-cultural community. It is the deeply rooted collective consciousness of humanity that the emotions of pity and fear, sorrow and delight, phobia and philia are reciprocated mutually by both the narrator and the reader or viewer. But if such an influential and mighty medium is misused to portray a particular community through some imposed inclined attributes, it casts perilous impacts, aggravates misconceptions, and alienates the minority. This caters to stereotypify a specific group with some fixed and shallow idiosyncrasies. As instance, Steven Spielberg, in his 1984 adventure film Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, ostents an Indian banquet where the dishes include baby snakes, eyeball soup, beetles, and chilled monkey brains. Both Shashi Tharoor and Yvette C. Rosser criticized this portrayal of India by the American filmmaker. In his article entitled Stereotypes in Schooling, Negative Pressures in the American Educational System on Hindu Identity Formation, Rosser writes, quote unquote, the wholly fictional depiction of India in the Steven Spielberg film, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, seems to have been taken as a valid portrayal of India by many teachers, since a large number of students surveyed complained that teachers referred to the eating of monkey brains. In the same vein, the misrepresentation of the indigenous people in mainstream Indian films and mass media reinstates the status quo identities within which they are forced to be cooped up for ages. It cannot be necessarily true that whoever comes from the districts of Bankura, Purulia, and Medinipur areas labeled as Jungle Mahal is a Maoist. Likewise, not every Santal is roaming around forest with bow and arrow, hunting wild animals, eating rats and rodents. Not only in the films, in popular culture like soap operas and sitcoms also, the tribes are shown as berserk yokels arriving in a big city with a surprised round-eyed expression as if confronting a brave new world, and all the townspeople are misbehaving, swindling, humiliating, and trying to exploit them. Such shallow, baseless, quotidian representations not only breed and entertain prejudiced ideas but antagonize the naive against a section of society. These displays deflect the multifarious nuances within the indigenous society. But in reality, nowadays, most of them have to travel to towns and metropolitan cities for their various trades, like blacksmithing, construction business, masonry, mining, digging works, etc. Besides these blue-collar professions, a number of people from indigenous background are working in white-collar jobs, as in academia, medical sector, IT, finance, judiciary, etc. For example, in Akrosh, the role of public prosecutor played by Amrish Puri emerges from indigenous community. Though the character seems to be introduced rather to highlight the choking caste system wherefrom a self-built individual is still struggling to rid himself, hankering after recognition and validation from the upper caste superiors, even at the cost of betraying his own clan and violating professional ethics. This dimension of the character is comparable with Bhuvan Sardar, played by Sadhu Meher in Mrigaya. When the whole tribe unites against the British forces to protect and hide the rebel depicted by Shamit Bhanja, Bhuvan, a disgruntled tribal, stabs in the back of his own tribe and informs the enemy of the rebel's hideout. The tribal people have invariably been showcased as an exotic throng, fit to be experimented upon. In popular culture, they are fixated into a particular social group. The tropes of their subjectivity are confined and often belittled by the top typical characteristics of gullible innocence or even to the extent of vulnerable immaturity, wild, unruly ferocity, dark seductions of village maidens, irrational impetuosity, lack of urban sophistication and wit. They are posited in the victim seat in every sphere of popular culture. Thus, the contributions served by the mass media and cinema operate as agencies to sustain and naturalize the hegemonic ideology. Popular culture discourses legitimate the dominating cultural takeover and naturalize the continuing imposition of overbearing values, practices, and institutions. The labeling of Mohua Memoirs, a documentary by Binod Raja, as activist harang and thereby dismissing it from the locus of mainstream cultural narrative reinstate the strive to validate the socio-cultural superiority and urban industrial economy in tribal regions. The film brings forth the lives of tribals in the hills of Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh that are altering due to the disruptive mining in the name of development. The situation is reminiscent of the satirical expression of Sir Thomas More in Utopia. If the natives won't do what they are told, they are expelled from the area marked out for annexation. If they try to resist, the utopians declare war, for they consider war perfectly justifiable when one country denies another its natural right to derive nourishment from any soil which the original owners are not using themselves, but merely holding as a useless piece of property. Interestingly, the mainstream mass media sponsored by the authority overlooks the oppressing scenario, marking the rebels with the stamps of Maoists or Naxalites. The negative representation of indigenous peoples is strategic. Ileana Pagan Titelbaum aptly observes in Glamour in the Andes, Indigenous Women in Peruvian Cinema, quote unquote, there are dangerous and alienating repercussions that a torrent of images loaded with negative stereotypes can have on the contemporary imaginary. Most of the representations are homogenized depictions of indigenous peoples, denying their social diversity and cultural identity. It is an advertent political construct that situates them into the subordinate positions. The dichotomization of us and them perpetualizes this politics of representation. Elizabeth Furniss observes, quote unquote, urban and rural presses alike are adept at manipulating news frames as a strategy of political containment. Rural presses deflect criticism of local aboriginal, non-aboriginal conflicts into rural-urban dichotomies, while urban presses deflect challenges to state authority by evoking noble savage imagery and reducing aboriginal claims to localized conflicts. Indigenous storytelling is considered to be a tool to resist assimilation and sustain the elements of their language, history, and culture. Indigenous storytelling is viewed as an act of resistance and decolonization. The tool of storytelling, like personal narratives, can be an effective agency to enable cultural interaction and negotiate social familiarity. Personal narratives are an efficient, effective tool to do away with the wrong impressions cast by inaccurate statistics or prejudiced stereotypes. But it better be from someone within the community to retain the note of authenticity and accountability. Personal narratives can validate the experiences of the narrator, and validation is the sine qua non for the marginalized groups and indigenous communities in media representation. While talking about stereotypes, Duncan McHugh asserts that pertaining to the indigenous people, most of the narratives represent them as quote-unquote WD4 or warrior, dancing, drinking, drumming, and dead. To counter these biased, fixated representations, many indigenous tribes around the world are endeavoring to air their issues through their own channels. In New Zealand, for example, the Maori people have launched Maori Television, an independent station to broadcast tribal programs and news coverage. Language is a crucial element to protect and understand a culture. This is why in Maori Television, many programs are broadcast in Maori language. For example, the action-adventure series Kaira Kau and the language learning show Korero Mai are exclusively in the tribal language. Jennifer Gauthier, in her essay Lest Others Speak for Us, The Neglected Roots and Uncertain Future of Maori Cinema, affirms that indigenous culture and lifestyle are different from the mainstream culture, and therefore the ways of manifesting indigenous aesthetic is also distinctive. However, not only cultural awareness, as Robin Pierrot claims, but the academic inclusion of indigenous narratives, cultures, and traditions is also requisite to augment familiarity and negotiation with the majoritarian discourses. To break away the hegemonic ideologies which regulate representation of indigeneity, the tribes themselves should come forward and articulate their voice amidst the settler colonial mainstream cultures. The ventures in this regard have also begun. The Adivasi TV is the first Santali satellite TV channel. Though burdened with financial crisis, they have produced many films like Chando Likhan or The Script of God, Sagun Ena Sohag Dular, which is loosely based on the 1982 Bollywood film Nadia Ke Paar, Jui Juri or Life Partner, Haire Are Chali or Alas Our Customs, etc. Sita Nalare Sagun Supari was screened at second edition of Nepal Indigenous Film Festival 2008. Bardu, one of the most remarkable Santali films directed by Dasrath Hasda, had won 7 awards from AISFA or All India Santali Film Association. However, Hasda regretted the fact that the state governments are sparsely funding them and even hardly reserving a slot in Doordarshan to promote their cultural heritage or language. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipanjan.
Thank you,
Again, a
ma'am.
presentation which has thrown up queries and also maybe observations, I hope. I'm expecting some of the students who are listening in to respond to this presentation. With this, we move on to our next speaker. Ragini is still not here. She has not responded, Debusri. So I'm moving on to Krishnendu. I've sent a message, but she's still not responded.
Sure.
Okay, because
Sure.
under the circumstances, I don't want to pressurize her.
Sure.
Krishnendu Pal obtained his BA and MA degrees in comparative literature from Jadavpur University. He has been awarded another MA in South Asian Area Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London. He specialized in the literatures and cultures of Canada as a part of his MA degree in comparative literature from Jadavpur University. He currently works as a PhD scholar in the department and teaches MA level students at the Center for Canadian Studies. His main area of interest is queer and feminist literary criticism in the Canadian context. He particularly enjoys teaching two-spirit creations and queer diasporic fiction in class, and also tries to look at the relationship between literature and the other arts. Krishnendu, if you could talk about, tell us your topic and then begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Gratitude is an integral component of academic research, and nobody likes ungrateful people. So I want to firstly thank Sucharita Di and Debushree Di for giving me the opportunity to speak at the webinar. I would next want to thank my sister Amrupali Chatterjee, because without her, this paper wouldn't have possible in terms of giving me resources and snippets of motivation at all hours of the day. And I would finally want to thank my friend and colleague Debjani Chakraborty, whose expertise on the field has made me reconsider my notions about doing Indigenous studies. Thank you. My paper is titled To Talk About Yourself and Your Own, reading Mani Shakabi's A Two-Spirit Journey. So at the risk of squaring the circle, I begin my presentation. The genre of the autobiography has been a potential site of scholarly contestations in terms of its politics, limitations, and its claim to authenticity. The contestations vis-a-vis authenticity mainly hinge themselves on questioning the legitimacy of something fluid and dynamic like memory. They also question the legitimacy of autobiographies as reliable sources to look at history. The nuance that needs to be addressed first is that autobiography very approximately can be referred to as representation. The idea of representation also extends to fiction in terms of it not being the mirror of society, but as Susi Tharu and K. Lalita puts it, critical sources that contain evaluations and assessment of circumstances of a specific temporal and spatial context. Scholars like Paul Ricoeur have also tried to lay emphasis on the pre-narrative context of the author, that is circumstances that they dwell in, which invariably has significant impress on them, which at the end of the day makes writing possible. It is the intervention of diegesis and form in the process of writing that brings out the vitality of a genre in question. In the case of the autobiography, it is the functionality of the autos, the I, on which the prerogative of deciding the content of the work depends on. Life is a haphazard occurrence which lacks a cohesive semblance, and this semblance has to be brought while writing about life. It is the prerogative of this I in question to decide the befitting content for the autobiography. By befitting content, I mean the task of filtering incidents from the incohesive continuity that life is and arranging them in a way that provides this notion of semblance that writing asks for. The additional stress that is given to certain temporal fragments in life and also the presence of the contemplative voice of the narrator are wholly dependent of the prerogative of the I, and this prerogative often hinges on the political position that they aspire to speak from. It is a representation, but it is also a potential site of inquiry in terms of looking at alternate understandings of history, which official renderings have often conveniently eliminated. Oral historian Alessandro Cortelli asks one not to dwell on the inconsistencies and factual errors in the different narrative versions of a particular incident, but to dwell on the relevance and the relationship of the content and the content articulator in question, to pursue questions like why a particular incident has created such a significant impress on a certain group of individuals. Why is the same incident remembered differently, rather experienced differently by people belonging to the same docile? These theoretical enunciations become extremely relevant in the context of Crow Ojibwe individual Mani Shakebe's autobiography entitled The Two-Spirit Journey. It is necessary to mention that in her case, the autobiography is presented in the told to format, where she collaborates with Marie Louisa Palmer to talk about her life. The nomenclature of the work itself suggests that the impetus to speak is propelled by the intersections of identity markers, rather identities that is embodied by Mani, and the implications that these markers have in her life. Two-Spirit is a marker which people from various indigenous communities in the North American setup identify with in order to assert their existences that do not conform to heteronormative binary of the male and female. It is a term that embraces the intersection and the vivid, multifaceted manifestations of the queer. The two thematic thrust areas that come up in her autobiography is the manifestation of the trauma and the successive mitigation of it. The process of speaking about this trauma to Plummer and then Plummer writing it is also understood by Mani as an attempt of mitigating rather healing from the trauma. Now, a very common aspect of indigenous oral traditions in the context of Canada is the embedded performativity and the acceptance of a circular notion of time as opposed to a linear notion of time. The circular notion of time approximately means understanding of time not as a chronological flow, but as a value-loaded occurrence that only gets meaning out of human experiences. Incorporation of this notion of circular time in the autobiography of a two-spirit woman is undertaken collaboratively by Plummer and Mani by striking a balance between the thematic and the chronological categorization of events of Mani's life. The word collaborative writing becomes imperative in this case because Plummer, as she mentions in her afterword, was conscious in terms of not appropriating or ventricularizing Mani's voice. Mani, in addition of being an oral narrator of a story, was actively involved in the writing process that was done by Plummer. Mani was basically fluent in Cree and Ojibwa and who picked up broken English during her life in Canada, was aware of the fact that her freestyle narration of incidents of the past and her often grammatically incorrect English would serve as a hindrance in terms of comprehensibility of her life circumstances to the readership, indigenous and non-indigenous. She consents to Plummer's attempt at striking a balance between the thematic and the chronological and at making her narration solecism-free. Plummer mentions that the draft of every segment was read out to Mani and she voiced her notions, concerns, and most importantly, corrections. Mani prioritizes dissemination of knowledge of her circumstances with strict adherence to what is popularly understood as quintessential indigenous writing. To her, what is of cardinal importance is letting people know of the intensity of violation and her equally intense methods of reclamation in its entirety. And hence, to neutralize the possibility of palliation of that intensity, she negotiates with her ways of articulation in collaboration with her writer Plummer. This is what Sophie McCall refers to as a collaborative method of writing in her seminal book, The First Person Plural, which talks about the problems vis-a-vis appropriation of the native voice. The limitation surrounding consent through coercion and aspirational mobility is there, and very little can be grasped from a distance. I still think this can be a start to engage in ethical practices in terms of indigenous studies. Mani's life, as appears in her autobiography, is infested with recurring violence, right from her day in the bush, where she lived with her kokum, her grandmother, to coming out as a lesbian in the town of Thunder Bay in the 1970s. She shared an abusive relationship with her alcoholic mother, Deborah, who, in Mani's words, often hit her for fun. Growing up, Mani was subjected to immense bullying and sexual abuse while still at school, which compelled her to sedate herself with the use of alcohol and gasoline sniffing. She was married to a man called Gus from her community, who was elder to her and subjected her to immense sexual and physical torture. One incident so intense that she was compelled to give premature birth to her son Martin. Mani's narrative allows a lot of textual space to the description of incidents of rape and sexual violation that she had to face throughout her life. These incidents have majorly involved men, both indigenous and white. This allocation of textual space in order to speak about trauma that one has faced also extends to the idea of the prerogative of the I in the autobiography. Mani not just identifies the necessity to speak about these unspeakable acts of violence in order to bring to the public eye the intensity and frequency of violation which indigenous women face, but also to engage in retelling of a traumatic act as an attempt at healing through articulation, which Eskimos and Smoleski understand as the reawakening of senses to digest and indigestible experiences of the past, to look for and propagate inherent coping mechanisms, resistant tactics that might help the successors. Mari also narrates in great detail her tryst with alcoholism and how it affected her life. Eskimo and Smoleski observed that in the context of indigenous communities in Canada, unmitigated transmission of historical trauma often allows the surge of maladaptive social and behavioral patterns. Trauma disrupts positive adaptive trends and perpetuates maladaptive trends that proceed as symptoms that are passed to the second generation as socially learned behavioral patterns. The trauma in the case of Indigenous Canada is characterized by the physical and cultural genocide perpetrated by the onslaught of colonization, epidemics, the residential school system, selective assimilation, and so on. The frustration emanating from this unmitigated trauma, which also extends to the loss of traditional life skills, language, bleak prospects in terms of social ascendancy, often finds vent in self-deprecating aberrant practices like alcoholism. As the autobiography as a genre allows the narrator a contemplative space while focalizing on certain life incidents, Mani utilizes this and clearly mentions that in spite of abhorring her mother for her alcoholism, she unwillingly got into the practice because it seemed to her as the most accessible coping strategy that borders on sedation. This instantiates the notion that rampant essentialization, rampant typification of certain social behaviors in groups of people without tracing the root of it is often internalized by the individuals from the next generation without minimum interrogation. This essentialization also bases itself on the vacuous and yet virulent premise of ignorance. The virulent consequence of ignorance is studied by Eve Kozlowski Sedgwick in the context of validation of homophobic violence. Ignorance about non-heteronormative sexual and gender identities proceeds towards the negation of these identities. And then these negations are concretized as regimes of truth through unchecked popularization. The state and the community sanctions violence on queer bodies out of something called homosexual panic, that the queer individual, if not checked through repressive measures, would cause irrevocable damage to the heteronormative social order, which is the basic unit of family. Mani is often dumbfounded by the violence she faced on the streets, especially from women of her community after she came out as a lesbian on a TV interview. She's perplexed because her kokum had made her aware of the existence of two-spirit individuals in the community who embody both the male and female spirit and were venerated at one point of time for their skill sets and healing powers. This also sheds light on the nuance of generated ignorance that exists in the people from her community who have been conveniently made to forget and ostracize the social occurrence of their traditional past. The influence of Christianity, as Mani mentions, also cannot be ignored in this case. But a lot of textual space is also accorded to the attempts of ending and interrogating the cycle of despair which hinders well-being. Mani speaks elaborately about her work as an alcoholism counselor, her engagement with Alcoholic Anonymous groups, and her role at LGBTQ protests and gatherings. Her autobiography stands testament to the fact that effort changes circumstances and upholds an alternative to the socially learned behavioral patterns which have been used to essentialize and castigate queer and indigenous people. She's actually trying to break the chain of oppression through her attempts. And lastly, what is important is that Mani upholds the motif of trust at very significant junctures of the book. Right at the beginning, she says that at one point of time, she could not trust white interviewers recording her grandmother's voice. She cut off the wires of their devices because she felt that they would permanently steal her voice in their boxes. This mistrust is also an intergenerational baggage that has been handed down to her with the unmitigated trauma. But it has to be remembered that it is Mani who also collaborates with a European woman like Plummer to write her autobiography, which speaks of the trust that she could finally acquire in terms of letting somebody disseminate her stories. The trust, needless to say, bases itself on collaboration and albeit an ethical one. And that ideally should be our primary concern while engaging in indigenous studies. At least it can be a start to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishnendu. Devasri, would you do a little bit of summing up and then we can actually move on to the questions?
Yes. I think thank you very much for well-researched papers. It was a pleasure listening to all of you. I have a few questions and a few queries, and before I do that, I would like to read a little bit from a piece of a poem by Natalie Clark, who has been working with Indigenous women for a long time, belongs to an Indigenous community herself. And given the fact that we are within an academic session, I was wondering how you would look at it. And also, I was also wondering how would one look into the limits of framing intersectionality within the Indigenous research approach, and how does one go into it? And of course, it's an interesting combination from looking at actually frameworks of understanding, then going on into popular media and popular representations, and then going on to actually a particular aspect within Indigenous communities, which has been problematic within Indigenous research as well. So now this is a poem, and and I was wondering if any of the panelists could respond in terms of what this poem has to offer and how one would like to look at one's own research with respect to this poem. So this poem says, this is how the poem goes. This is a giveaway paper. I offer it as a prayer, as a giveaway poem. There is no ceremony for completing an academic paper. post-colonial, anti-colonial, decolonization, all words that swim around inside my head, while poems offer islands of refuge from this academic space I now traverse. Inspired by the poetry of Christos, I ask, how can I make an offering for this paper? It forms in strange corners and spaces of my mind as I move between the library, taking books out on theory, and dance with my children at the powwow, where I'm reminded of older unrecorded ways, writing with my children all around. Ancient truth tellers, Mama, you're not on holidays, calling me on the work that is all around us, all around me. So if one could actually respond to processes by which this could be looked at. Also, this was a question that I had for Krishnendu in particular. If we are looking at how do we kind of revitalize indigenous learning, indigenous teaching? I mean, I do understand that you look at it. If you look at two-spirited people as not only just marginalized members, but as leaders and as role models, how does one look at it? And how does that break into the relationships with colonial and indigenous systems, especially with respect to gender? And also, I mean, how does one, therefore, is it possible to revisit social justice when one goes into it, into these processes? And for Debjani, there was this question, it is something that one read at one point, and I'll come back to the reference later on. It says, it has often struck me during the times I have worked in indigenous perspective. Let's not come at this from a deficit perspective. Let's not look at all things that are wrong. I think when we come at this asking what are the strengths, we can move forward in ways that lead for everyone. So I understand that you did speak about it at the end of your paper in terms of what is the approach, but I was wondering if you could actually provide frameworks within your own field research experiences of the way forward as well. And Dipanjan, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the representation in terms of popular representation in media, and how does one actually combat that popular representation as a young researcher? What is it that you would like to do to combat that media? I mean, how do you think it is possible? So I think these are things that I've been thinking about while listening to your papers, which I thought was which I thought were very well done actually, and keeping to the time was also remarkable for all of us. I think so we need to learn from you as well, I think, in terms of being very professional about it. So thank you, and over to you for your responses, if there are any.
Should I answer?
Sure.
Attempt to answer. Yeah.
Yes, go
So
ahead. Yes.
one thing that I've understood as a researcher as well as a teacher at the Center for Canadian Studies, which deals with indigeneity, is that theory loses its efficacy if not made sense by human inhabitation. And it is not about imposing a certain kind of theoretical structure on a narrative so that a cherry picking is done in terms of acquiring results that one wishes to acquire. In case of looking at social justice in terms of doing indigenous studies in Canada by somebody who is situated in the post-colonial setup at a university in Canada, is to understand the processes of convergences and divergences that might play out while looking at one circumstances in comparison to that of the other. And this comparison should not be done in terms of any kind of hierarchization of the premises. For instance, I mentioned in my paper that a very important thing which Mani does is she comes up with her corrections. She comes up with her correction when Plummer is trying to say something with respect to Mani's life. I do not know if infrastructure in the setup of a third world would permit us, but it would really help us in terms of engaging with the works of people who are still living while their texts are being taught in class. If their versions of what is being said and their, most importantly, their corrections are being spoken about, that would make sense. And in terms of talking about a certain kind of marginalization, which I do not per se share, I would refer to what Sharmila Rege calls situated knowledge, where I would want to function as an ally who would try their best not to appropriate voices, but help amplify voices as much as circumstance allows it to me, provided with permission from the people whom I desire to talk about. This is what I think of.
Thank you.
Should I go next, Debashree?
Sure, go ahead.
Before I speak about or address the notion of how to move forward from here, from the things I've already spoken about, I wanted to ask you, what does the deficit refer to in the quote that you have mentioned?
That's what I wanted you to address. That how would you look into the idea of the deficit? Are we looking at the idea of the deficit in terms of theory? Are we looking at it in terms of practice? Because I mean, the example that you're giving us of the real living example of the baby, for instance, and about intervention and not intervening, for example. So, and how does one articulate deficit? Do you understand what I'm talking about? How do you articulate deficit? Also, perhaps one needs to also stretch our understanding of the idea of deficit, perhaps, because we are not really looking at material realities only. We are also looking at the object of research that one is doing, if I may use that word, and I'm using it very consciously here. If you're looking at the object of research, what is it? How do you articulate your reservations, if there are any, because there are, if you're honest with ourselves, there are, of the object of our research. So how do you look at, there is deficit even within the research, as we all know, right?
Yeah.
Because we have been schooled in a particular way. So I'm curious to know, given your field experiences, how would you address that? How would you look into it? Because I'm sure you have, because if you've stayed with the community, you've interacted with the community, been on the field, I'm sure you've had all of these experiences, right?
Yes.
All of these experiences which go on, which is why I found that poem with the whole idea of the academic paper very interesting. And because it was a poem that put me into trouble, and I thought it would be a good idea to put all of us into trouble as well. So, yeah.
While I agree with the idea that the research one conducts, no matter how hard one tries, it will have deficits. And here I'm approaching the word deficit in terms of the meaning of, let's say, lacuna, perhaps, that it will never be enough and it will always have loopholes and it will always be a work in progress. What I don't agree with, however, is the use of the word deficit in terms of the process that one undertakes. I mean, the final result might have deficit, but the process or the problematics that I was speaking about, I do not like to think of them in terms of deficit, because then that would imply that there are clear-cut solution in order to overcome those deficits, or in order to fill up those loopholes and address those lacuna. What I am saying, in my very limited experience, both in terms of reading and field experience, is that we cannot avoid those pitfalls. It is never going to happen, because human existence and human experiences is in a constant state of flux. And since fieldwork revolves on the fulcrum of human interactions and extraneous circumstances, there will always be pitfalls no matter how much we try to avoid them. In fact, maybe even in in the path to avoid the pitfalls, we commit or we encounter more pitfalls. The point that I was trying to make is that, and this might sound paranoid, but this is what I believe, that one has to be continuously aware from hour
Mm-hmm.
to hour of one's actions in terms of how one approaches that pitfall.
Mm-hmm.
এই মুহূর্তে দাঁড়িয়ে আমার এটা মনে হতেই পারে যে আমি এতটা বুঝে গেছি, I know so much, I will never take up a superior mantle, I will never take up the mantle of the oppressor. That is the problem.
Hmm.
That I have to constantly keep on questioning myself. The other thing is, yeah, and the way forward would be, in a sense, I would slightly embellish what Krishnendu has already said, in the sense that while without human experiences or human understanding, theory is almost redundant. In terms of communities that I work with, where there are like no traces whatsoever of that particular community, what theory does is helps us figure out our bearings in what is essentially a very uncharted scenario. But I would also say that we cannot place primacy on that theory over what one experiences on the field. I was going to say something else. Give me just a second.
Yeah, sure.
Way forward.
One
I'll
observation.
I'll
Okay,
say
okay,
it
go
once
ahead.
I remember it.
The Debjani, one thing that I was wondering
Yeah.
is, did you feel any kind of resistance during your field trip? Did you have to, what kind of endeavor did you have to put in? Did you have to be extra patient? What kind of approach did you engage in?
Right.
I was just wondering because I have had Dhiman working on a similar project, you would be knowing.
Yeah.
And we have a webinar on the Chara community coming up in a few days. Maybe you should attend that, and that would definitely help you to look at new directions, I think. So I was just wondering that if you could talk for maybe a couple of minutes, when either it's resistance or it is a welcome. I mean, what was your experience?
Uh, the thing is that when one tries to find one's place in a community that has to be close knit or is extremely hostile to outsiders because of the history of violence and
Exactly,
atrocities that they have faced,
exactly.
resistance is very very common. But with me, it's a slightly interesting angle because I started interacting with the community not as a researcher. I have been a teacher to the children of that community since I was 19. So, because I was a teacher, there was that modicum of respect and that modicum of familiarity already there. Yes,
Okay.
but when I know maybe, let's say, 10 families, when I'm trying to venture beyond that, there is obvious resistance, obvious hostility. Even in certain instances, when I'm just trying to interact with these families, there are objections from other upper caste households of the hamlet or of the village
Huh.
who are either offended that I did not seek their permission before engaging with people who are essentially dirty.
Okay.
More so because I am from their brethren, their biradri, upper caste.
Okay.
Also because how dare they speak to an outsider? ওদের এত আস্পর্ধা কি করে হয়ে গেল? These are extraneous resistances, but from within the community, I no longer face that much of a resistance because I have worked with them for years. I remembered what I was going to say in terms of the way forward.
Yeah, please go ahead.
If I may
Yeah.
just finish that while constant awareness is a necessity, what Devoshti said about the object of one's research is is also something that needs to be that one needs to be extremely cognizant of in terms of the way forward. And this is where disciplinary paradigms play a crucial role. If I am working within a certain disciplinary paradigm, irrespective of my personal intentionality, I would have to adhere to disciplinary object. And in some instances, they are really, really very problematic. I don't want to like criticize academic disciplines here, but maybe we can.
You may actually. It's okay.
I
Right.
find the top-down approach of most schools of anthropology very problematic. Now there have been
Yes.
recent strides in social or cultural anthropology in places like, let's say, uh, Berkeley, and so as people like David Moss or Aarti Sethi who have done really sensitive work. But historically, that discipline has adhered to certain strictures, and and we know that these strictures are still followed. So maybe within the academic realm, at least, the way forward can be addressing those strictures with perhaps the same intensity as Stephen Sotosi questions the disciplinary paradigms of comparative literature. But that can be a can be the first step. In terms of individual, I think I stick to what I said. You have to be constantly cognizant and realize that from moment to moment you risk becoming an oppressor, and you have to come to terms with it. And it's a very difficult space to inhabit, and it has terrible implications on one's mental health. But there is no other, at least I believe, more ethical way forward.
Okay. Debjani, there's a question for you in the chat box.
Dipanjan has to respond to Sucharita.
I know.
He-
Dipanjan will
Yeah.
respond, and after that, Debjani, there's a question for you in the chat box.
There are two questions actually.
Yes, there are two. Yes, Julie, you may.
There are.
Hello, ma'am. Uh, Actually, the question about how to negotiate with the media representations of the indigenous people, media coverage focuses upon the indigenous through an outsider's eye. Their narratives are streamed or published only when they fit into the larger framework of majoritarian politics. And indigenous people are represented as criminals, quote unquote, backwards, or as, I'm quoting, vanishing from history. It is spoken by Catherine E. Fort. Catherine E. Fort, in her book The
Right.
Vanishing Indian Returns, there she says that they are vanishing actually as mainstream media are treating them. For example, in West Bengal, the indigenous people and the indigenous contexts are hollered about, spoken about. Whenever there is a mass movement, unrest, the Maoist movement or the Naxalite movement, and certain people, the names of which I don't want to call upon in this academic arena, but whenever there is a agitation, the sensationalized reports by mainstream media cover visuals of movements by indigenous people, but not the prolonged contexts, the contexts for which this movement, this agitation are actually uh, being caused. The strategic exploitation and oppression against them are not depicted actually. So how to negotiate with this this politics of representation, and I have hinted at the ways the indigenous people are actually trying to represent themselves through their own media, through their own channels. I think this is the only way, because someone within the community, from the community, will perceive their problems, will understand their context, their situations far better and more appropriately than someone outsider, and they are doing that. I think that's the way to negotiate with such representational problems.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That does address some part of the question. Yes. Debjani.
Yeah, uh, I'll address Kaustav's question first, and then uh, maybe Julie can ask me the question if that's all right.
Absolutely.
That's fine. That's
Thank you.
fine.
Okay, so his question is: intervention and non-intervention both are and can be interpreted as either epistemic violence or violences of other kinds. Nevertheless, he insisted on the importance of listening and field work. See, uh, Kaustav, this is a very interesting question. Thank you. Uh, the first thing is that when I was making the choice of undertaking field work, I was not as cognizant of the risks of violence as I am now, after I have been through the process of field work and also spend a large amount of time retrospecting on it and then writing on the field work. So the thought process or the reasoning behind choosing field work had nothing to do with the uh, propensity or potential for epistemic violence. I wanted to undergo field work because I thought, see, one can stand on the bylines and amplify voices, as Krishnendu said. But if there is no sign of the voices at all, one needs to unearth them. And there was no other way to find those voices apart from going on the field and immersing oneself in the field. That is one, because I have worked in 3 archives. Motamoti, it's not like I have gone through them in a lot of depth, but so far as I have seen, there are almost no traces of the Parthis in documented records or in terms of academic work or literary work. So if there does not exist a certain voice, you cannot amplify it. You need to unearth them, right? That was my primary motive behind going on to field work. Also, I think because, and this is perhaps not the most academic thing to do, but because I was personally invested in them, I had known them for a long time. It to me it seemed very iffy and very patronizing to write on them without their inputs or their imprints on the work. The reason why I still stand by the choice, despite recognizing the potential of epistemic and other kinds of violences, is precisely the same reason why I started it. That despite the risk of violences on oneself, as well as the violences that one risks committing, I do believe that there is no other alternative to immersive field work. If voices are, if you are looking to figure out or amplify or unearth the small voices of history. Mm. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Uh, Julie, had a question, Julie?
First of all, I think what is amazing is the level of engagement, the passion, and the honesty that has come through Devjani's, Dipanjan's, and Krishnendu's papers. Most impressive, right on target. There was no kerfuffling around. You hit the nail on the head. And Devjani, what struck me very much is that you had a compelling way of putting across with overwhelming honesty, unpretentiously. Because of the three papers, unfortunately, of course, we've all missed Ragini's presence in this webinar. But be that as it may, I want to push you a little bit on the issue of this, the dual presence of you as a researcher and somebody, according to your own confessions, who had an investment in this community, that you had taught them, that you had done so much work by way of being so close to them. What comes to mind, actually, two things. One is in her usual wry and very sarcastic sense of humor, Mahashatya Devi had once told me in an interview that there is this unmitigated impulse to better the indigene's condition, which I think she fell prey to as well, And the other is in their theoretical framework on the ethnographer's gaze, Akhil Gupta and James Ferguson, I remember this point that you made of really holding back when you know that there is injustice in the form of the way, for instance, the marginalized or the second-class person in the family, the woman, is treated. So how do you negotiate? How do you actually draw the line where your moral compass doesn't come in the way of your staying as an observer? Devjani, this must be a very hard thing.
First of all, Julini, it's so nice to see you after so long. And the questions you asked are, to call them is difficult would be an understatement, because these are questions that I grapple with every single day, because it's not just about your research or about you submitting a thesis. You are interacting and affecting a community in some way or form, and the question one inevitably asks oneself is that, "Tumi ke?" Who do you think you are that you have so much audacity to intervene in this space? The first hurdle that I had to cross was address the myth of objective research, first of all. Because this is something that was asked to me during my MPhil, before I was going on fieldwork, that since you have been associated with them, how can you be sure that you will be able to occupy the mantle of an objective researcher? So, and because academics are convinced only by other academics, I had to delve into a lot of theory and practicing ethnohistorians like Jan Vansina or Portelli's work in order to establish that the notion of objective research has and always be a myth. Because even if you consider yourself objective and you have no personal investment in it, even then your subjectivity is intervening between what is happening, what you are witnessing, and what you are writing. So objectivity is not something that we are aiming towards. Good work that is grounded in theory, is well cited, is ethical, is perhaps all we can attempt to do. The other thing that I am not claiming that in all instances I have been innocent and I have been non-intervening. I haven't, because when it happens on a day-to-day basis, at some point you do speak up and you do say that this is, please don't do this. You try to say it with as much sensitivity and politeness as one can muster, but then I have been guilty of intervention and therefore perhaps epistemic violence as well. I have intervened in situations where I possibly could not take it anymore. And I am not proud of it. And it is something that I have to work on constantly. The other thing is that, irrespective of my personal investment, what sort of helps me stay grounded is the training, is the academic training that has been afforded to me. Like, other people have gone through the same before me. I can read that and I can understand it. I can learn more. I'm not saying that I'm always successful with it, but I try.
Good. Thank
That's
you.
about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
There is another question, I think. Shuddhadev, very nice question. It's a combination of both because once again, in Habitations of Modernity, Dipesh Chakraborty says that people's engagement with labels is never one-dimensional. It's a dynamic relationship. So their initial reaction is that of revulsion. They don't think it's the tag of ex-criminal tribe. It is more colloquial than that. ये तो पैदा चोर है or born criminal or just thieves and so forth, and their initial reaction is that of revulsion. And if one has read once Paulo Freire or one would go on to read once Paulo Freire, one recognizes that the first response that the oppressed has towards oppression is to identify with the oppressor and become a sub-oppressor, as opposed to resisting that. So what happens with them is that because they are constantly hounded by this label, and this is a subcaste of the Parthis that I work with, they are Bal Parthis. What they do is that they uh, call other subcaste of Parthis, let's say Cheetah Parthis or Phase Parthis, as criminals, and they call it all a big misunderstanding. They say that they are the real criminals and they are the thieves, and people just think that we are as well, as opposed to resisting the entire idea of the criminal tag altogether.
Mhm.
The other thing is the accent. Oh, and there is some form of internalization as well. Maybe not of the ex-criminal tribe precisely, but maybe of a certain brand of inferiority. Because, and we witness this with all sorts of marginalized communities, be it within the realm of gender or caste or race. If you have been historically oppressed without any form of legitimate or palpable intervention whatsoever, what eventually you start believing in your inferiority as well. It happens on an individual level too. So what happens is that uh, suppose in their creation myths, and there are various creation myths, other professions or other castes are created out of, let's say, clay or mud or maybe metal. But the Parthis are created out of the gods, the dust or the dirt on the god's uh, chest or body. So the others' creation is rooted in something still better than dirt. It's clay, which which amounts to something. It's metal, which amounts to something. Dirt is just useless, right? So they associate their birth with dirt. And there are many such instances of self, you know, self denigrating, self deprecating notions of who they are and where they are coming from. I
তো
hope that addresses
তো
your
ওদের মানে কমিউনিটির লোকজনদের এই আইডেন্টিটির সাথে কোনো প্রাইডও নেই, আবার কোনো রেজিস্ট্যান্সও নেই, একটা
no,
ইন
that
বিটুইন
is
সিচুয়েশন।
no, but then uh, that's what I mean when I say that it's a fluid dynamism. It's
রাইট,
not that there is no pride. There is
ওকে,
a lot of pride because they
রাইট,
and the pride manifests itself in very strange ways as well. For them to evoke community pride is to evoke the Ramayana and is to evoke the battle or the
হুম
resistances against the British.
হুম
So there is pride. There is also pride. They constantly try to establish that other indigenous communities or Adivasis have been relegated to the forefront over the last few decades, but and this is how they say it, that we are Adivasis, we are the primary inhabitants of the land, but nobody pays attention to us. So it's
রাইট,
not that there isn't pride,
ওকে,
but there is also self-denigration.
ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
There's another question in the chat box. Two questions.
Yeah.
One for
And then one from Paloma. And then one from
Paloma is
Paloma.
open question. Yes.
Yeah, for all the panelists. Interesting.
Hello.
Yes, Dipanjan, go ahead.
Yes, yes. Uh, the question addresses, as far as I could understand it, that the Santals, who are one of the largest ethnic groups from the Southeast Asian region, why are not they assimilating other tribal efforts in their literature or in their narratives? Actually, these people, indigenous people, are very sensitive about their culture, their language, and that's why maybe whenever the government educational projects or very incentives are being given away for their educational developments, still they are holding on to their heritage, their tradition, their cultural past, and they are not maybe consciously or unconsciously, inadvertently, they are not taking that opportunity. As being said that, having said that, when we are talking about other tribes, the same condition is applied also here, that the other tribes, they are not trying to assimilating with the cultures of another tribe. So when the Santal literature through the Olchiki language holding up to academic arena, the through the Olchiki language, Olchiki alphabets, Santali language is being studied academically, epistemologically, but other tribes, they are not coming in, or maybe the Santali tribes, they are not inviting, welcoming them in their in such projects, in such developments or advancements, maybe because of their this sensitivity, because of their uh, effort not to get assimilated and lose their cultural identity. This fear always is lurking within their unconscious or maybe conscious mind, as far as I could understand after reading these about these things. That's all.
Now for everybody responding to Paloma's open question.
Can I respond to Paloma's question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, Paloma. This idea of constantly grappling with the notion of not reducing lives to research topics is something that has taken our sleep for a very long time. And it is very difficult for us to come up with a concrete answer in terms of this because we are always trying to not done the, as Devjani says, the mantle of the oppressor, and as I begin my paper with, to not try and square the circle. But what we can do to ethically validate our research and for our mental health as well is to look into our research as something that would benefit the community as a whole. And mind you, this benefit is not something that steeps into patronization. This benefit is something and that the onus of working for their benefit, the consent of that has to be acquired from the people that we engage to work with. I mean, I can say in case of Devjani's research, it is important in terms of looking into the voices of a tribe, a group of people who have been incriminated for no fault of theirs. And if Devjani's research can actually contribute in somewhat palliating the extenuating circumstances of their life, then why not? And I'm sorry, Devjani, I'm referring to your research right now because that is what came to me very spontaneously. That's all. I hope I could answer your question, Paloma.
Paloma?
Any more responses?
Hello, everybody.
Yeah. Hi, Paloma. Any more responses to Paloma's question? Because it's an open one.
I would like to just add on to what Krishnendu has very adroitly put already, is that you ask what other modes of approach can researchers employ to truly amplify these voices. I think this is where interdisciplinarity also comes in, because if you are constantly grappling with newfangled modes of oppression, then you have to be innovative in terms of what methods you employ to amplify the voices. So once again, if one is limited within disciplinary rigors, one cannot be as innovative, but one can try. For instance, I have a number of journalist friends and they were looking for the next big story. So I sort of slightly deceptively and perhaps even manipulatively directed this journalist friend of mine to the Parathi issue in Madhya Pradesh and made her come down from Delhi and interview these people and speak about the Parathi presence in electoral politics and so forth. And then that article came out and it was spoken about, and it was a very small, perhaps insignificant step, but I innovated and I don't have regrets about that. So perhaps one needs to respect the rigors of a discipline, but also be willing to innovate while within the sticking to the realms of ethicality. Yeah.
Dipanjan, would you like to respond as well, or would you be in agreement with Krishnendu and Devjani? Okay.
Actually, what strikes me in this question is that part where Paloma says that how do researchers, meaning why we are treating the indigenous people as research topics merely, meaning they are merely cut to this figure of research topics and research subjects. Actually, this is a right point, because in every webinar, in every seminar, and in every project, they are shown, they are treated like there's some special kind of alien race whom should be studied, eagerly, keenly, and they could not study themselves. They should not and they could not have this capability to study themselves. There should be an outsider from a higher caste with some higher intelligence, who can come down to them like a redeemer, and who should study and who should announce their voice to the outside world. This approach is what is quoted again and again by other two speakers, that epistemic violence is starting from this point. They should be treated as a fellow human beings, as we are. And the approach here, I think it should be encouraged within the community, that someone who is coming from and within that community, he or she should represent them more brightly, more figurative, more enthusiastically. That will be more appropriate, I think. I mean, if you think about Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak or Mahashweta Devi, both of them are outsiders. How could I believe that what they're portraying is exact, is correct? Meaning they are observing, but they are not living within. That's my point, actually. I mean, that's a question unanswered.
I read Julie's comment. No, Julie, I haven't read it properly, but I'm really interested in looking at how the magic realist mode helps in incorporation of certain indigenous experiences in narration. I really look forward to reading it. Thank you for your suggestion.
I think you'll enjoy that. Debashri and Sucharita, may I just make a very brief comment in answer to Dipanjan's remarkable insight into
Yes, definitely, Julie. Definitely.
Dipanjan, I think you made a wonderful point. Though you went right up to the the lion's den, but you didn't open the door. Exactly, that is the whole point that we are constantly debating in post-colonial theory about the subaltern being able to speak, and are we appropriating their voice? And quite rightly, neither Dr. Spivak Chakraborty nor Mahashweta Devi are one of the indigene. None of us are. So we are always going to have to come to terms with the fact, as Debjani has also said, that we are speaking for them. But as you say quite rightly, the only other alternative is that they have their own TV channel, they have their own anchors, they have their own artistic, literary and other creative representations. So you're spot on. The subaltern can speak and they will speak. But it's a hard, long, uphill journey. It's not going to be easy.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
There's a question for me in the chat box. Can I respond to that?
Please.
Yeah. Thank you, Sukanya, for the question. This notion of the two-spirit, which basically characterizes a marker which manifests all the identity intersections which create the marker of queer, is something that has been very much prevalent in the ethos of indigenous communities, at least in the context of Canada. Like people who identified with as two spirits pre-contact times were actually eulogized by the community for being the possessor of skill sets that belongs to two genders, and also as healers. And with the advent of colonialism, the nuances of Victorian morality, the idea of biopolitical discrimination about sexual practices, like what is procreational sex and what is recreational sex, all of this started manifesting in the ethos of the indigenous communities as well. And that is when this censure about queer identities started, and as I mentioned in my paper, like Mani herself is very perplexed with the fact that she is facing violence from women, her friends, her cousins from the same community, because this presence of a person who is not conforming to heteronormative sexual practices has always been there. Just the panic that is associated with it, the ostracization that is associated with it, is getting a certain kind of amplification, majorly during the contact period. Right. By contact period, I mean the onslaught of colonization. And in terms of that you said that we are talking about queer theory, queer literature, and queer criticism. We also have like proper movements going on. It is happening in the context of Indigenous Canada as well. I can suggest you some writers like Beth Brandt, Thompson Highway. You can look into the paintings of Kent Monkman, and you will realize that they are trying to construct a repertoire of signification in terms of embedding queer vocabulary which people can resort to in the context of Canada, that is. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Any further queries or any further observations? Devutri, then maybe we should wrap up now.
Yes, absolutely. And we have the next webinar coming up on the 4th.
So thank you everyone for being with us today. And we look forward to all of you being with us again for the next webinar.
Thank you very much to the speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Devutri, Sucharita. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.